Go. So welcome to our lecture number 105. It's pretty wonderful that we made it up to lecture 105 of our study of the More Nevuchim, the Guide for the Perplexed. All of my page references are from the Shlomo Pinas version. This one, which we talked about several times, we're in volume 2 of that version. We're part 3 of the Rambam, about to start studying chapter 20. Now, last time we started chapter 20 together, but this time we will, I want to start it again. And here he addresses the issue, which he touches on in Mishnah Torah as well, but it really fits into his discussion here. We've been talking about the issue of providence mostly, and that is providence meaning that God knows and controls what happens to us in this world minute to minute. And we discussed Rambam's view of providence, which was fascinating, but he's going to go off on a little tangent. So you have to listen to the previous lectures to get that part. But in chapter 20, because he referenced, of course, many times God's knowledge. What does it mean that he knows things, right? So the beginning of chapter 20, he's going to talk about the problems, the philosophical problems that philosophers generally have with God's knowledge and how it leads to all kinds of mental contortions. And then he's going to answer and explain why it's not a problem according to him, right? So, so a matter concerning which there is a general consensus. I am now on page 480 of starting chapter 20. There is a general consensus is that it is not true that new knowledge should come to him, may he be exalted, so that he would not know now what he did not know before, right? So philosophers would say, right? Remember, God is one, right? There's nothing in his essence of division. There aren't 2 parts, there aren't 3 parts or 10 parts. God doesn't have attributes. There isn't him and then the qualities that pertain to him. There's just God, right? So therefore, it's impossible, right, that he should know something today that he didn't know yesterday, because that would constitute a change in God's essence, right? In other words, because if you and I know something today,
why is the answer to sense? Why is the answer to this sense new is a time-related adjective, but God is timeless, so it's not.
Well, yes, that's part of that's part of what he's saying now. That that whole concept of dividing things by time is something that only. So remember, God is outside of creation by conceiving of God as the creator of everything, and that he preceded, and I don't mean in time, but that's the only word we can use, preceded the creation of the world. Then anything that we use that pertains to a description of the world that's around us does not pertain to God. He's outside of that. So we measure things in time and distance and size and weight and color. We measure and describe things in all kinds of ways. None of those can possibly pertain to God, right? But so here, so we know that it can't be that God knows something today that he didn't know yesterday, right? Remember, the Rambam he's talking philosophically now, and he's going to, well, let's see what he does. And it is not true, even according to the opinion of those who believe in the attributes. Remember, Rambam mentioned a group of Islamic thinkers that believed that you can give God attributes. In other words, you can describe him and say he's merciful, he is kind, he is wise. You can describe him with attributes. And Rambam already told us that we are not allowed to use attributes to describe God, because again, that would infer some sort of division within God. Remember Rambam's theory, we discussed many times the theory of negative attributes. We can only describe what he's not what he is. But that's not the subject for today. But the bottom line is, even if you do believe in attributes, but it cannot be that he should have many and numerous insights. It can't be that God thinks today, oh, today, I am going to be watching what's going on in Ukraine. I'm going to be watching what's going on in Israel. I'm going to be watching what's going on in Namibia and Uganda. I'm going to check it all out, and I'll know all this stuff. In other words, like you and I, we can read 10 articles, and we know 10 things, right? But God, it can't be that God knows 10 things, because then again, that would hint to division within him. After this has been demonstrated, once we state this, we, the community of those who adhere to the law, meaning those who are religious, right? The version you guys bought for me from Goodman, and they just translated here to the law as those who are religious, right? Say that he knows with one single knowledge the many and numerous things. It has to be that whatever God knows, right, he has to know it with one knowledge. He just knows it all, and it's one thing. It's just one thing that he knows, right? For as far as he may be exalted is concerned, insights do not differ because of the difference of the things known, as it is the case with respect to us. You and I might, I'll say, you know what? It's cold outside, so it feels cold. I'm going to put on a jacket. It's also raining, so I'm going to pull out an umbrella. And it's also dark, so I'm going to turn on my headlights. Right?
We
So
gotta watch that.
all of these things are it can't be that he knows all of these facts, right? Because like we do. Similarly, we say that he has known all of the things that are produced, right, anew before they have come about, and he has known them perpetually. The other thing we also must state about God is that he knows everything, right? He must know everything, right? And that he must know everything always, and he must know everything that's gonna be, right? For this reason, no new knowledge comes to him in any way. So it can't be that today he learned something, right? Because whatever he knows, he always knew, right? So for seeing that he knows that a certain man is now non-existent, but will exist at a certain time, right? He knows that some guy who's going to be born in the year 2050, let's say, right? He knows he's going to be born in 2050. He's going to live from 2050 to whatever, 21, 45 or whenever he lives to, right? And then we'll go on existing for such and such a duration, and will then again become non-existent. Then he's going to die, and then he won't exist anymore, right? There will be for him no additional knowledge. When that guy is born in 2050, God doesn't all of a sudden know something new. And then while he's living his life, God doesn't know new things every day. And then when he passes away, God doesn't all of a sudden now know, oh, now he's gone. It just doesn't make sense. As he is, nothing was produced thereby that was unknown to him. On the contrary, something was produced of which it had been perpetually known that it would be produced in the way that it come into existence. Thus, it follows necessarily from this belief, right? Remember, the question of God's providence, the difficulty of God's providence, and its contradiction with the idea of free choice is really what the Rambam is getting at over here. So we're going to see how he resolves that problem in a moment. But he's stating things that have to be obvious about God. And once he makes these statements, then he's going to tell us which things that led philosophers and thinkers to say things that just really don't make that much sense, right? Or don't fit according to the Torah, at least. And then he's going to tell us how the Torah would deal with this kind of a problem. Thus, it follows necessarily from this belief that knowledge may have as its object non-existent things and may embrace the infinite. If this is true about God, then God clearly knows things that didn't happen yet, right? And he also knows the infinite, because remember, Rambam told us that the world doesn't necessarily have an end date, right? The world can continue on forever. Remember, he argued with Aristotle, who said that it doesn't have an end date and it doesn't have a start date either. According to Aristotle, the world always existed as it is today and always will exist as it is today, right? So if God knows everything, then he can know the things that are infinite, right? Which again is beyond our conception. We can't conceive of infinity, right? And this is indeed our belief. For we say that it is not impossible that his knowledge should have as its object the non-existent things about whose being brought into existence he knew beforehand, and that he is able to bring into existence, right? This is true, right? We agree with this, right? That God knows things that didn't happen yet, right? On the other hand, that which is never brought into existence is, with reference to his knowledge, an absolutely non-existent thing. If there happens to be a thing that never existed and never will exist, say in Rambam's example a while back, a triangle with 4 angles, right? Can you make a triangle that has 4 angles? It's an impossibility. You twist your brain trying to conceive of such a thing, right? Such a thing that will never exist. That's not within God's knowledge, because it's impossible, because it's not something that will ever exist, right? Which is not an object for his knowledge, as that which is non-existent for us is not an object for our knowledge. As for knowledge of the infinite, there's a difficulty about it. So then, now that we say that God could know these things, some of the people of speculation, so how could he know these things, right? How could this be? How does this work? So the philosophers some groups profess the opinion that knowledge has for its object a species. They tried to explain it by dividing up knowledge. God knows the species. In other words, he knows how human beings work. He knows how lions work. He knows how rocks work. He knows how each element works, right? But the divisions, right? So he knows all of that, right? But he doesn't necessarily know, right? But in a certain sense, it extends to all individuals and species. So he knows that human beings have two eyes, a nose, a mouth, and all the different parts that make a human being up, right? He knows that the human species operates in such a way that certain things are going to happen and certain things are going to be done and so on and so forth. But he doesn't really know what each and every person is doing at every moment. This is the opinion of all those, right, who adhere to who are religious in the sense, who adhere to a law in view of what is required by the necessities of speculation. As you're thinking this through, you have to say something like that, because a person of religion has to believe in free choice, right? So he can't know what I'm going to choose tomorrow, right? And you see throughout the Torah commands us, do this so that such and such doesn't happen, or do this so that such and such happens. So a religious person is going to start thinking, and many thinkers are going to say, yeah, so he knows humanity. He knows how human, but he doesn't know what Saul Weinreb is going to decide to do tomorrow morning when he's confronted with a dilemma, right? So the philosophers, however, affirm decidedly that his knowledge, so that's how a religious person has to come up with some kind of a plan this way. As you're going to see in a minute, that this doesn't really work either. But then the philosophers who aren't religious, who don't need to have free choice play into their scheme, so they'll say, they affirm decidedly that his knowledge may not have for its object a non-existent thing. They'll say, no, God doesn't know things that didn't happen yet, and that no knowledge may embrace the infinite. It's impossible to know something that's infinite because it's impossible to know such things. Consequently, as no new knowledge may come to him, because God can't learn something new tomorrow, right, or today even, it is impossible that he should know anything of the things that are produced anew. It's impossible that God knows what's going to happen tomorrow, because he can't know things that happen tomorrow because they didn't happen yet. Right? So accordingly, he only knows the permanent, immutable thing. All he knows is a permanent thing. Whatever it is that he knows, it's a permanent knowledge that he knows, something that always is, right? And remember, in Aristotle's world, the entire world always is, always was, and always will be. So those are those philosophers. That's what they would believe. Another doubt, however, arose in some of them, and some of them thought like this. Even if he should know only the permanent things, let's say he knows everything that is. So that means he knows lots of stuff, right? So he would have many insights. That means he knows what the temperature is on the top of Mount Everest today, and he knows how many gallons of water are in the Indian Ocean, and he knows all these things. He knows tons of all random stuff. So then then we're making divisions in God. So for if the things known become many, the insights regarding them become many. So to everything known, there is a knowledge that is special for it. Consequently, he only knows his own essence. Must be God doesn't know anything. Only thing he knows is himself. So all of these, the point here is not so much to go into all these different philosophies, which you can go on and talk about forever. The point here is what Rambam is about to say, is that all of this, what I myself say, I'm on 481 now, the third paragraph. What I myself say is that all these difficulties to which all of them are subject, including the religious people who have this difficulty of trying to explain that God knows the species, but he doesn't know, he knows how humans work, but he doesn't know what decisions humans are going to make and what the different philosophers say. All of this, the reason why they have this problem is they have as their cause the fact that they established a relation between our knowledge and his. They're very, very confused, right? They think that he knows things like you and I know things, right? Now, remember, when you and I know things, and I'm going to use more modern terminology, what does it mean that we know, right? We're using the synapses of the neurons in our brain are firing off, and we store knowledge in images and words and ideas, and we put knowledge away in our brain, and we know things, right? And we know them temporally. We know them based on our conceptions of time. We know things that happened before. One thing happened before the next thing, and this thing will cause the next thing, right? We know we divide things up by the people that we know, by the concepts that we know. We divide it all up in our brain, and we have lots of ideas. We know things. We understand human knowledge, at least to the extent that we do, and people are studying it more and more and learning all kinds of things about how we know things, right? But if you think that that's also how God knows things, then you have a big problem. You have all these philosophical questions, and you could sit and argue and smoke a pipe and argue forever and ever, hours on end about what God knows and how it could be that he knows if we have free choice and blah, blah, and you'll be back and forth. You drive yourself crazy and you'll have a twisted brain. But the Rambam said no, right? For every sect considers the things that are impossible for our knowledge, they think, what's impossible for me? Like if I knew with 100% certainty, now I can't, but let's say I did know with 100% certainty what's going to happen tomorrow. That means it's going to happen tomorrow. So it's not possible for it not to happen. So if God knows what's going to happen tomorrow, then it has to happen tomorrow. And that brings up all kinds of philosophical questions, right? If I know 10 things, that means I have 10 spots in my brain where I'm storing 10 pieces of knowledge. So there's 10 things in my brain. So it must be, if God knows 10 things, there's 10 parts of his brain, right? And so on and so forth. And consequently thinks that it also holds necessarily with regard to God's knowledge, or else that the thing is obscure for it. The philosophers ought to be blamed more strongly than anyone else with regard to this question. The philosophers are completely all wrong. They're all messed up over here, right? Their whole question, the premise of their question is wrong. For they were those who have demonstrated there is no multiplicity in its essence. We proved philosophically that God is one. There is no two things. There is no multiplicity. There is no two aspects to God, or three aspects, or 10 aspects, or 900 billion aspects. It doesn't matter, right? Maybe exalted. And that he has no attribute as essence. We can't describe him by saying he's a this or he's a that, right? He's above creation. Anything, any term, any concept, anything that you or I will come up with that refers to God will be from within this realm that he created. He's outside of creation, right? The laws of nature and the atoms and the subatomic particles and the physics, whether they're completely irrelevant to describing God, right? His knowledge is his essence, and his essence is his knowledge. There's no difference between God and his knowledge. There's just one entity, and that is God. And we cannot describe it in any way. There are no words we can use to describe him. I just turned the page to 482. As we have explained, they were those who have demonstrated that our intellects are incapable of apprehending the true reality of his essence as it really is. The philosophers explained, and Rambam explained to us, that we as human beings are completely, totally incapable of apprehending, of describing or understanding God. It's something that's impossible. It's beyond us. We can talk forever and we can talk round and round and round. But the bottom line is, at the end of the story, we are people of creation. We are creatures on this world, in this universe. We cannot comprehend a being that is completely outside of this universe, no matter what we try to do. So how then can they think that they can apprehend his knowledge? So why all of a sudden did they start thinking, when they're talking about God's knowledge, that they understand God's knowledge and that it works according to the same rules that the knowledge that you and I have works, right? Seeing that his knowledge is not a thing that is outside of its essence, right? If his knowledge is the same as his essence and we can't understand his essence, then how do you think you can understand his knowledge? Why are you even asking such questions, the Rambam is saying? Why? It's stupid. You're asking a stupid question. When you ask me how it is that God knows what's going to happen tomorrow, so then what does that even mean? Like, what kind of dumb question is that, right? You don't know anything about God's knowledge, right? You don't even know what it means that he has knowledge, right? So for the self-same incapacity that prevents our intellects from apprehending his essence, the same way we're incapable of understanding what God is, also prevents them from apprehending his knowledge of things as they are. The fact that God knows things, we have no idea what that even means, that he knows things, right? For this knowledge is not of the same species as ours, so that we can draw an analogy with regard to it. It's a totally different thing. We're using the word knowledge, but the word, that's because that's the only language that we have. But the word knowledge describes what you and I have in our brains. It doesn't describe what God has. That's something that we can't even describe. We have no words for it. Words, the language itself cannot do it, right? But a totally different thing. And just as there is necessarily existent essence from which, according to their opinion, every existence derives of necessity, right? Just like there exists a God, right? Or that, according to our opinion, produces all the things. In other words, they think. In other words, what's he saying? He means the Aristotelians think that prime mover is the essence from which everything has to be, right? But for what we believe, that at a certain moment in time, and I say time in parentheses because Rambam says it's not really time, because time itself was created at this moment, right? That preceded everything and created everything, right? So do we say that this essence apprehends all that is other than itself, that in all the things that exist, nothing whatever is hidden from it. The bottom line is that we don't know it and we don't understand it, but God, being the creator of every single thing that exists, right? Being the creator of the entire system, of course he knows everything that's going on within the system. But what does it mean that he knows it? It doesn't mean the same thing when we say that you and I know something, right? And that between our knowledge and his knowledge, there is nothing in common, as there is nothing in common between our essence and his essence. In the same way that you and I are not gods, and we can't describe what God is, because we have no language, we have no brain that's capable of describing such things. With regard to this point, only the equivocality of the term knowledge occasions the error. The reason why we're making the mistake is because we're using human language to describe it. We're using the word knowledge because we're pretending that we have knowledge and God has knowledge. And remember, Rambam emphasized 1 billion times in this book so far that it's not just a quantitative difference. God has knowledge, but it's so much smarter than us. Like, I only have an IQ of 120. He has an IQ of 800 bazillion. No, that's not what it means that his knowledge is better than ours. It means it's of a completely different quality. It's a qualitative difference. It's something else, but we have no other way to try to describe things other than use our language. So we use the word knowledge. That's it. And it confuses all these philosophers and starting to ask these questions. For there is a community only in the terms, whereas in the true reality of the things, there's a difference. If we had something extraneous to language itself, that was godly, which obviously we don't have access to, then maybe we can describe it. But obviously there isn't, because we're not, and there's only one God, so there never will be, right? It is from this that incongruities follow necessarily. It's because of that confusion that they have these problems, as we imagine that things that obligatorily pertain to our knowledge pertain also to his knowledge, when we start thinking that the things that pertain to our knowledge pertain to his, and that's just a giant mistake. So one of the things that have become clear to me by the texts of the Torah, so I'm in the second paragraph on 482, is that his knowledge may be exalted, that a certain possible thing will come into existence, does not in any way make that possible thing quit the nature of the possible, right? In other words, one thing that's clear from the Torah that I do know about God's knowledge, Rambam says, we don't know God's knowledge at all. But I can tell you one conclusion based on the Torah that I can tell you for sure to describe the nature of God's knowledge. And that is that whatever God's knowledge is, it doesn't mean that something in the future has to happen, right? It doesn't mean that. In other words, if God knows that it's possible that Joe Schmo, whatever, some guy is going to rob a bank tomorrow, whatever God's knowledge of it is, however he knows that, it doesn't mean that Joe has to rob the bank tomorrow. He could decide, you know what, I don't think robbing a bank is such a great idea. I won't rob the bank tomorrow, right? On the contrary, the nature of the possible remains with. He could rob the bank tomorrow, or he could not rob the bank tomorrow, right? And knowledge concerning what possible things will be produced does not entail one of the two possibilities becoming necessary. The fact that God knows it, whatever it means that he knows it, it doesn't mean that it has to happen. It doesn't make sense to you? Yeah, because you're thinking about your knowledge. When we said that God knows something, right? If I know something, then it has to happen. When God knows something, it means something else, and I don't know what it means. So don't ask me questions about it, right? This is also one of the fundamental principles of the law of Moshe, a principle concerning which there is neither doubt nor a contestation, right? If this were not so, it would not have said, you know, you have to build a thing around your roof to make sure someone doesn't fall off it. Why does the Torah warn us to do that? If the Torah warns us to do that, inherent in that command is the idea that if I build a fence, then some guy who otherwise would have fallen off my roof, God forbid, and broken his leg, won't fall off my roof and won't break his leg. So inherent in that commandment, right, and many other commandments too, but that's just Rambam's classic example, obviously, there is something that may happen or may not happen, right? And then the Torah tells us to do something in order to change the potential thing that was going to or not going to happen. Or likewise, when it says, lest he die in battle and another man take her, you know, if a person is called to war, right, and he's newly married, we say he's exempt from the war, right? Because if he might die and then someone else will take his new wife, and that would be a terrible tragedy, and so on. Right? So that means don't send him to war, because if you did, he might die, right? But now that you didn't send him to war, now he won't die. So again, it's a command telling you to do something in order to change a potential outcome. And that, in this case, is the death of this young man, right? So the point here being, similarly, the whole of religious legislation, the commandments and the prohibitions goes back to this principle, namely that his knowledge concerning what will happen does not make this possible thing quit in its nature. However, this constitutes a great difficulty for the apprehension of our inadequate intellects. It's very hard for us to understand this because our intellects are inadequate. Our intellects are incapable of understanding things that are beyond us. Intellect and knowledge itself, when we talk about God's knowledge, we are completely incapable of understanding God's knowledge, so we cannot even ask that question to begin with. All right, consider in how many ways, and Rambam is going to try to hammer this idea into us. I want you to think about these things that Rambam is about to say, because it just proves how little access we have, or how zero access we have to what God's knowledge is about, right? So consider in how many ways is knowledge different from ours, according to the opinion of all those who adhere to the Torah, right? In the first place, number one, I'm starting page 483. His knowledge, while being one, corresponds to many known things belonging to various species, right? We say that God's knowledge is one, but you and I have lots of knowledge, whether we're good multitaskers or not, right? Well, the bottom line is we have lots of bits of knowledge in our head. I know, what setting to do the laundry when I wash my whites, right? I know, what temperature when I'm cooking food in my oven. I know how to drive to work. I know all kinds of things, right? But God, that's all one thing. So how's that? Does it make sense to you? No. Why? That's because we don't understand his knowledge. Number two, in the second place, it may have as its object something that does not exist. God could know something that doesn't exist. In other words, he might know something that's going to happen 100 years from now, right? Which we have no idea how are we supposed to know? How could he know such thing? Well, that's because his knowledge is different from ours. In the third place, it may have as its object something that is infinite. God could understand infinity. We can't conceive infinity. We can't quantify it. We have no mathematical equation that can describe something that doesn't have a quantity to it, right? In the fourth place, his knowledge undergoes no changes in its apprehension of things produced in time, right? In other words, when something happens in the future, he didn't learn something new, right? And yet it might seem that the knowledge that a thing will exist is not identical with the knowledge that it already exists, right? For there is in the latter case a certain surplus, namely the fact that what has been in potential has become actual, right? In other words, you and I, right? I might be the greatest, say, meteorologist in the world, and I might have the greatest computer models, and I could predict with 99.7% certainty that tomorrow at 2 p.m. it's going to rain in New York, right? But I don't really know it until it actually rains tomorrow in New York, right? Because it might not, right? No one has 100% knowledge of what's going to happen tomorrow. Even we can predict with the best possible models what's almost certainly going to happen. But until it actually happens, we don't know it, right? With God, he already knows it with a certainty that we can't even comprehend, right? In the fifth place, it is in accordance with the opinion of the Torah that God's knowledge may be exalted, does not bring about the actualization of one of the two possibilities, right? Our knowledge would necessitate something to happen if we actually knew, right? Whereas God's knowledge does not necessitate a particular course of action, knows perfectly how one of them will come about, right? Accordingly, would that I knew in what way, according to the opinion of those who believe that knowledge is a superadded attribute, our knowledge resembles his, and whether there is here something other than a mere community in the terms. According to our opinion, that is, the people who say that his knowledge is not something superadded to his essence, his knowledge is the same as his essence, it is truly necessary that his knowledge should differ from ours in substance, just as the substance of the heavens differs from the substance of the earth. And that goes to the philosophical, the physical idea that the Rambam described before, that above the sphere of the moon, the nature of substance is different. That kind of all related to Aristotelian physics and astronomy, which we went into in the past. It's not that important right now. But the bottom line is that God's knowledge is something completely different, and we cannot access it. The prophets have explicitly stated this, and I'm just going to quote directly from the Isaiah, from Yeshayahu, chapter 55, Kilo machshivotay machshivotechem, right? My thoughts are not like your thoughts. V'lo darchechem derechai, your ways are not like my ways. Noam Adonai, so says God. Ki gavu shamayim me'oretz, the heavens are above the earth. Kein gavu derechai midarchechem. In the same way that the heavens are different from the earth, my ways are different and above yours. And my thoughts are different from yours. So what the Rambam is understanding this verse to be saying is that God's thought process, his knowledge, so to speak, is so completely different from ours that to ask questions about how he knows something that's going to happen tomorrow, right? And it still doesn't necessitate a specific outcome. It's a question that we shouldn't even be asking in the first place, because it makes no sense. You're making an assumption that God's knowing is the same as our knowing, and that in itself is wrong. Well, we're going to see in the next chapter, if we get to it tonight, I really wanted to, that ultimately, according to Rambam, is an arrogance. It's a tremendous amount of arrogance, because when you ask a question like that, right, and the fundamental assumption of someone who asks, if God knows what's going to happen, then how could it be that I have free choice to decide what I'm going to do, right? Right. So it must be that and they ask, what you are is being arrogant, according to Rambam. You're making an assumption that you're like God. You're making an assumption that you know what it means when God knows something, and you don't, right? So the bottom line is humility, is understanding that God is above us. He's someone that we cannot comprehend. So don't sit and walk around pretending that you comprehend him. This is going to be a crucial key. This idea of arrogance and humility when it comes to philosophy is going to be a crucial key to understanding how Rambam continues to deal, because he's going to get back to the subject of theodicy when he discusses the book of Iyov, right? Which is going to be in chapters 22 and 23. We're almost there, right? Is the underlying arrogance of the person, right, who asks the questions in the first place, right? So, but I'm getting ahead of myself. To sum up the notion that I have stated in resume, right? I'm on page 483, the second paragraph. To summarize everything I said, and he wants to bang this into our heads, so he's going to summarize it again. Just as we do not apprehend the true reality of his essence, just like we have no idea, we cannot comprehend what God is, but know withal that his existence is the most perfect of existences, but nonetheless, we know that he is, right? We just can't describe what he is, and not commingled in any way with any deficiency or change or being acted upon. He doesn't change. He doesn't learn new things. He doesn't forget things. Today he's not different than he was yesterday, and he's not different than he will be tomorrow, etc. Right? And so although we do not know the true reality of his knowledge, because it is his essence, we do not know the true reality of it. We do not know that he does not apprehend at certain times while being ignorant at others, right? We do know that he does not apprehend. Right. So in other words, so we cannot, there is no flaw in his essence. There's no flaw in his knowledge. Right. We know that it can't be that he knows something today that he didn't know something before, because that would suggest a flaw. Right. I mean to say that no new knowledge comes to him in any way, that his knowledge is neither multiple nor finite. There is no measure. He's not 100 billion times smart, because you don't measure God's smartness. Right. He's not. He doesn't know lots of things, because that would suggest a multiplicity within him, and there's just one, right? That nothing among all the beings is hidden from him, and that his knowledge of them does not abolish their natures. The fact that God knows things doesn't take away the nature of a human being, which is the nature of the ability to choose our paths in life, right? God's knowledge of stuff does not contradict our nature and our ability to choose our own path and to decide how we're going to act. So for the possible remains as it was with the nature of possibility. Just like tomorrow, lots of things are possible. I could decide to wake up and not go to work. I could decide to wake up and go to work. The consequences would be on my head, right? If I lose my job or not, right? That would be a decision that's based on what I decided to do, right? And that's the same thing with all of us, right? God's knowledge of what's going to happen doesn't take away the issue of possibility, that it could happen or it could not happen. All the contradictions that may appear, every time you think about these philosophical questions, that they start to drive our brains crazy, they make us jump through mental gymnastics. And the union of these assertions are due to their being considered in relation to knowledge. The only reason why I even have the questions is because you think that God's knowledge is like yours. right, which has only its name in common. But in truth, the only similarity between God's knowledge and ours is that we're using the same word to describe it. Similarly, the word purpose, in a similar way, when we talk about purpose, right, we talk about kavana, right? Kavana is the Hebrew word that Rav Kapach uses here. It's also used equivocally. So when we say that God does something because, right, or that you and I do something because, and now think of how this is a short reference here. This has a lot of relevance to the ideas of that play in the discussion of theodicy, right? And that is, right, you and I might decide to go to work tomorrow because I want to keep my job, because I want to pay my bills, right? Now, that's my purpose in doing that. So I think of things in those terms. I think I want to do this action because I want to get this result, right? That's not how God works. So when you even think of the concept of providence in the way God did this, right? This happened because he wanted. Like when I go out and I say, well, I got saved from that car accident, which happened a block ahead of me because God wanted me to be saved, right? Well, you're attributing cause like a human being attributes cause. That again is arrogant, right? God doesn't work that way, right? And how does he work? I don't know. We can't describe it. He's God, right? So similarly, the word providence, when we talk about God's knowledge about us in this world, his providence, right? When we use the word providence, it's also equivocally, right? You and I might have providence over, I don't know, if we're sitting on our couch and watching the kids play, we might be watching and seeing, and then we decide to take the toy away from the one kid who's misbehaving or whatever, right? So we might have some level of providence over those things and ways that we do things. And we think that God plays in the same way. He's this old man sitting in heaven and he's watching us all and he says, oh, you're a bad guy, whack, smacks you in the, oh, you're good, I'm giving you a prize. Hey, this kid gets a lollipop, right? That's not, the whole idea of God having providence is so different from our idea of providence that even thinking that he works that way is arrogant. Thinking that's what he's doing is completely, it's just wrong. It's such different things. We can't comprehend his providence. We can't comprehend his intent. We can't comprehend his purpose, and we can't comprehend his knowledge. So asking questions that are based on the assumption that his knowledge and he's like us is simply wrong. Okay. It is accordingly true that the meaning of knowledge, the meaning of purpose, and the meaning of providence when ascribed to us are different from the meanings of these terms when ascribed to him. When therefore the two providences or knowledges of purpose are taken to have one and the same meaning, when people start thinking that they're the same thing, then the above mentioned difficulties and doubts arise. Then you have all those questions and you have books and books and books written, people arguing back and forth and yelling at each other about this one's right, this one's wrong. It's all based on nonsense. It's all based on assumption that's wrong, right? When on the other hand, it is known that everything that is ascribed to us is different from everything ascribed to him, truth becomes manifest. But if you just realize that he's different in a way that we cannot comprehend or understand, then you understand truth, because that's the truth. That's the bottom line. God is the creator of the universe. He's not the universe, right? The differences between the things ascribed to him and those ascribed to us have been explicitly stated. As I mentioned above in the dictum, neither are your ways my ways. That was his quote from Isaiah that he brought before. Excuse me. All right, that concludes chapter 20, which is an important classic idea of a Rambam, and a very, very important philosophical principle that the Rambam lays down, which is really his answer to the question of, a free choice, of how free choice and God's knowledge can interplay with each other. So his answer to the question is, it's a bad question. So I'm going to stop for comments, and then I'm going to try to cover chapter 21, which is also really cool. So it's short, but it's really, really powerful. So, but any questions, comments? Go ahead.
It's Jeff. The concluding sentence, neither are your ways my ways. It triggers in my mind, I think it's from Perkei Avot, may your will be my will, and my will be your will, or something to that effect. I'm But how is that?
Yes, so that is us trying to liken ourselves to God. Imitatio Dei is the
Right,
Latin.
right.
I think the
So if
so
it's true, either are your ways my ways, doesn't that seem to preclude the idea of imitating God?
yeah. So Rambam would say that we experience, right, the way we experience God, we experience Him as merciful, we experience Him as kind, we experience Him as the one that provides for us, who brings us life, who made us be here in the first place. That everything we have because He made a world in which we have these things, right? So trying to be like Him is trying to imitate those. And that is our job in this world. We're not saying anything about how God actually is. We're talking about how we experience Him. But yeah, so that it's a
Well, isn't that arrogant even to go down that path? You've convinced me that it's
yeah.
to use the same terms to describe knowledge, etc. It's very convincing. But then how can at the same time, at least in the law, the Torah, tell us to imitate God when we don't even speak the same language?
Well, I mean, I think I mean the answer was really what I said before. I mean, we imitate Him in the sense we imitate what we experience, the way we experienced His interaction with us, but not Him Himself. And it's important for us to understand that. But there are definitely a lot of terms and things which can mislead people, and do all the time mislead people within Tanakh, within the liturgy. There's a lot of things that would lead someone away from what Rambam just described us.
Well, we're created in His image, right? So from the very beginning, it was the whole Genesis starts us off on the wrong.
Well, you have to go back to our early lectures. The Rambam dealt with that. That was one of all the way back in the beginning of the book. What does it mean that we're created in His image? Those are important subjects, but yeah. So all of those ideas can be understood in very anthropomorphic ways. But if I was gonna describe the purpose of this book in one sentence, it would be to rid ourselves of thoughts of anthropomorphism.
Okay.
But it's very difficult for us not to think that way, because that's what our brains are. Our brains are human, right? We tend to think of things in our way, right? We humanize everything, not just human. We earthly eyes. We make everything into the way we understand the way the world works, and we have to understand that when we understand something, that's not the same thing as when God understands something. God's understanding is something that we have no access to even describing, right?
Well, does that reflect the fact that Maimonides is in a world above us? That is, like idol worship and all these things. That there are two levels of being. One, the average Joe or the average Jew, who has all these misconceptions, right. And then like Maimonides, who are so much above us. Is that sort of my takeaway?
It's I think it's treading on dangerous ground, but I mean, Maimonides certainly understood that the masses have difficulty with these concepts. Go to your average person in the street and ask them the question of how God could know something and I still have free choice, and they'll sit there and they'll twist their mind 16 different ways and tell you whatever they heard 10 years ago from some guy that gave a speech once, or some book or article that they read. But meanwhile, the Rambam is saying, just be quiet and stop asking this question, right? But let's no, these are all important things. Honestly, I got 15 minutes. I want to try to cover 21 because it's just really cool. But so a great disparity subsists between, this is chapter 21, between the knowledge and an artificer, in other words, someone who makes something, has of a thing he makes, and the knowledge someone else has of the artifact in question, right? So you and I, right, can a guy makes something, right? If I decide I'm going to make a clock, right? So he says, if the artifact wasn't made in a way conforming to the knowledge of its artificer, the artificer only made it through following his own knowledge, right? The guy made the clock because he decided this is what it's going to do. This is how it's going to work. This is how it's going to get powered. This is how it's going to measure time, and so on and so forth. So I know, because I made the clock, I know all kinds of things about it. So I know in advance how the clock is going to act, what it's going to do the night and the day and for the hours and the minutes and so on. With regard to the other one who looks at the artifact, but a guy comes to me and I give him this clock as a present. I say, go home and here's this beautiful clock, right? So his knowledge follows that. He watches the clock and he only knows what the clock is doing now and what it did 5 minutes ago. He doesn't know what it's going to do in 5 minutes from now, right? Anything he learns from after the fact. Thus, for instance, the artificer who made this box in which weights are moved by the flow of water, this is a water clock, which was already in use in the Rambam's time. The clocks that we have today, they didn't have yet, but they had these water clocks, right? So he knows the quantity of water that must flow, the changes in the position of the flow, the threads that are drawn, and the balls that come down. And he knows these motions, not because he looks at the motions that take place now, right? The guy that made the clock, he knows how it's all going to go. He knows how it all works. The converse is true for the motions that take place now only come about because they conform to his knowledge, right? Why do they? Because he designed the clock in such a way that the water and the balls should all go the way they go, right? However, this does not hold in the case of someone who looks at the instrument. The guy who's watching this water clock, for whenever the onlooker sees a movement, he obtains new knowledge. He watches the clock and now he knows, oh, so a ball's going to fall down every hour and another ball's going to fall down every half an hour and another ball's going to fall down every 15 minutes. That's what he's going to see, right? And by not ceasing to look on and gradually to obtain an increase of new knowledge, he acquires in this way a knowledge of the whole instrument. By watching it, that's how he learns about it, right? So, however, if you suppose that the motions of this instrument are infinite, right? But if what you're watching this clock and this clock is infinite, you can't possibly know everything there is to know about this clock because you don't know what it's going to do tomorrow. You know it's going to, maybe tomorrow it's going to run out of water, right? Maybe 10 years it's going to run out of water. Maybe the motions, minutes are going to get closer and closer together by a little bit every day until eventually an hour is going to be 59 minutes and then 58 minutes. Who knows? We don't know what's going to happen tomorrow, right? It's not tomorrow yet, right? So and if it's infinite, then it's impossible to know everything. In addition, the onlooker, right, is incapable of knowing any of these motions before they take place, for he only knows whatever he knows on the basis of what takes place. So in other words, if you're a scientific observer of the world, right, you can try to make predictions about what's going to happen tomorrow based on what you saw, but you don't actually know for sure what's going to happen tomorrow until it happens, right? A good scientific prediction will predict what's going to happen tomorrow, but you don't know 100%, right, until it actually happens tomorrow, right? Such is the case with regard to that which exists, taken as a whole, and its relation to our knowledge, and his knowledge may be exalted. For we know all that we know only through looking at the beings, right? How do we know everything we know about the world? Because we studied the world that we saw today and yesterday, right? Therefore, our knowledge does not grasp the future of the infinite. We cannot comprehend the future. Now, I can make predictions about tomorrow, but that's very different from knowing what's going to happen tomorrow, right? All the pundits can tell you that tomorrow, because the interest rates are going down, the stock market's going to go up and the bond levels go, and they could all say that and they could still be wrong, right? Because even the scientists can make predictions that might be 99.7% accurate, but there's one variable that they just didn't know about because it didn't happen yet. A meteorite's going to fall and mess the whole thing up and the weather's going to change, right? So you don't know, right? So our insights are renewed and multiplied according to the things from which we acquire the knowledge of them. So our insights continue to grow as we observe things. Every day we learn more about the world around us. He may be exalted is not like that, but God doesn't work that way. Because he created the world, his knowledge doesn't change. It doesn't grow tomorrow, right? He made it all happen. It happens tomorrow because he made it, right? Like the guy who made the clock. So I mean that his knowledge of things is not derived from them. He doesn't gain knowledge from watching the world. God doesn't learn what Saul Weiner's decide to do tomorrow morning because he looks at me tomorrow morning and sees, let me see what he's going to do today, right? That's not how his knowledge comes to him, right? So that there's multiplicity and renewal of knowledge. On the contrary, the things in question follow upon his knowledge. They happen because he created the world in such a way that the world works in the way that it works. So he knows, right? Which preceded and established them as they are. He preceded the world. He's outside of creation. That's why I emphasize that. God is not part of creation. He's the one that made creation, either as the existence of what is separate from matter, or as the existence of a permanent individual endowed with matter, or as the existence of what is endowed with matter and is changing individuals. But I'm kind of running through that a little bit faster than I probably should. But the point being that He made the world so that all the beings in the world, however they are, should be how they are, and so on. But follows on an uncorruptible and immutable order. There is an order, the rules of science, the rules of nature that he put into play when he made the creation. They are what they are, and they always will be what they always will be. Hence, with regard to him may be exalted, there is no multiplicity of insights and renewal and change of knowledge. He knows the whole thing, period, right? It doesn't change because he's not learning by watching it operate. He knows it because he made it all, right? And he designed it all, and he put it all into play in one flash of knowledge, right? So through knowing the true reality of his own immutable essence, by knowing himself, he also knows the totality of what necessarily derives from all his acts. He knows now what it is that he does. For us to desire, and here's where the arrogance thing comes in. If you think, right, for us to desire to have an intellectual cognition of the way this comes about is as if we desired that we be he and our apprehension to be his apprehension. If you're walking around thinking, right, that I am going to now comprehend everything about the world the way God does, that means you want to be God, right? You have to recognize our place. We can observe, we can describe, we can even try to predict, but we have to understand with our own humility that actual knowledge about the future, right, in this case, right, and certainly knowledge about God himself is something that we're incapable of doing. He who studies true reality equitably ought accordingly to believe that nothing is hidden in any way from him. So now that you understand what true knowledge is, you understand that nothing is hidden from God, right? May he be exalted. But that, on the contrary, everything is revealed to us now. He knows everything. And don't ask me questions about how could he know everything if I have a free choice tomorrow. Forget that question. We threw that away already in the last chapter, which is his essence. And that is impossible for us to know in any way this kind of apprehension. We cannot understand what that means, that he knows everything, but he does, right? Because he's the clockmaker that made the water clock. So he knows exactly what's going on, right? If we knew how it comes about, and if you're going to try to know how it could be that he could know, then you'd have an intellect in virtue of which an apprehension of this kind might be had. But this, however, is a thing that in which exists belongs only to him. Only God could know this because only he is the creator, right? May be exalted. And it is his essence. And that is the essence of God, which is something we have no access to as human beings. Understand this then, know this idea and get it straight, okay? I really wanted to get to a sentence which we're about to read, which is one of the most important sentences in the Rambam, and I'll read it in a minute. You'll see if you agree. For I say that this is something most extraordinary in a true opinion. This is the truth. This is the truth. It's the truth. It's the truth. And when somebody tells you, they can tell you that they understand the purpose why God did things. If somebody gets up and tells you that this and this happened because God wanted X, Y, Z, that person may not realize it. They might not want to be arrogant, but it comes from an arrogance because he or she thinks that they understand God, and we cannot understand God. To claim that you understand providence, that you understand kavanah, right, purpose, that you understand knowledge in the way God does, is an arrogant claim that's impossible for a human to make. And understand that it's not the truth. The truth is what I'm telling you, Rambam says. The truth is that we don't, right? If it is carefully studied, no mistake or distortion will be found in it. This is a very strong assertion. The Rambam has numerous times left the caveat that I might be wrong. This is one of the few, maybe the only place in Moreh Nevuchim where Rambam says, I am not wrong. And you will not find the problem with this statement. You cannot contradict this statement because it is the truth, right? Nor will incongruities be attached to it. No one's going to find the problem with this logic. This logic is 100% sound, Rambam says. And no deficiency is ascribed through it to God. Now, this next sentence is, I think, the most wonderful thing. No demonstration at all can be obtained with regard to these great and sublime notions either, for our opinion, right? So, and in addition to what I'm telling you, don't ask me to prove, right, that this is true about God. Right? You're going to come to me and tell me, well, prove to me that there is such a God who has an essence that's different from ours. Prove to me that there's such a God who has an essence, the way I'm describing, that's beyond, and that he's a creator. There is no proof for this. It's just the truth. Think the power behind that statement is so awesome that they cannot possibly be overemphasized. How many times have people come to you and tell you, I don't believe in God, prove it to me, there's no proof. Well, Rambam just tells you there is no proof. You're right, there is no proof. It's just the truth, right? It's not something I can prove, because how can I prove something that's beyond this world? The whole belief in God is something that's not provable. If someone claims that it's provable, that person is arrogant, because they think they can explain God and they think they can use human logic to describe and prove him. If you're going to try to prove God with human logic, then you don't even understand what God is. You missed the entire point. If you try to prove God based on your experience, then you're wrong, because we cannot do such things. It's just true because it's true. That's it. I cannot prove it, Rambam says. And this is where he says that directly, but he hinted to this many times, but this is his most clearly written time when he says that. I remember one of my sons was telling me that he heard some guy once saying, a Mor Nevuchim, he was giving a tour, and he was talking about the Rambam, and he said, the Mor Nevuchim is a book that proves through philosophical proofs the existence of God. And I just didn't really say anything. The Rambam explicitly states that we cannot do such things. It's not just here, it's other places too, but here it's clear. That's not what this is about. It's here to talk about philosophical truths, but it's not here to talk about proving God. Okay, so let's continue. That of the community of those who adhere to the Torah, right? Or if you want to, or the opinion of the philosophers, even if one considers all the differences among the latter with regard to this question, even according to the philosophers, that's not something that's provable. What they proved is if there is a God, right, what he has to be like, and they describe so on and so forth, right? And with regard to all problems with reference to which there is no demonstration, right? Whenever you have a problem, right, where you cannot prove it, no demonstration means, according to Rambam, I can't give you an experimental proof for it. The method used by us with regard to this question, I mean, the question of the deity's knowledge of what is other than he, ought to be followed. You have to understand this method. When you can't prove something, you have to understand and realize, right? In other words, about a godly matter, you have to understand and realize that godly matters are things that are beyond our comprehension. Understand this. And that's how he ends this chapter. I think this chapter is one of the strongest and most important chapters of the whole book, although there were so many that were important. But remember this and think about this and then absorb this. And we have, I'll open the floor for some comments, questions. We might go a few minutes over time. I apologize, but go ahead.
Oops.
Yeah.
Yeah, I have a question. The word arrogance, that's, I don't see that
No, that's
word.
my word. I'm adding it.
I know. So it's
okay.
You're making objective judgment.
I have a theory. I'm sorry interrupting you, but I have a theory that the entire Mor Nevuchim is based on the idea of humility and arrogance. And I don't know if I'll ever have the time to do it, but I want to write a book to that extent. But if I can't write a book, at least all of these lectures, I will demonstrate, that how that underlies almost every chapter of the Rambam. That being humble is the key to learning and knowing the truth, right? And it's arrogance that leads you away from realizing the truth as the Rambam is trying to teach it. And I think these two chapters today very vividly demonstrate that point. But that's I'm not saying it's my idea, exclusively mine. I'm not obviously not the only person to make that observation, but that is really the underlying theme that I personally see from the entire book, right? And even though the Rambam is often criticized for being an elitist, right, as we kind of alluded to that before, I think when you really study the Rambam, you see he's anything but. I mean, he's elitist in a certain way that he realizes that so many people don't get what he's trying to say, but he's anything but an elitist. When he searches for truth, he wants to find the truth no matter what. And that takes humility. It takes real humility. I mean, think about it. How many times have you had a conversation with somebody who wasn't humble, that wasn't really interested in the truth? Probably the last time you had that conversation was very recently.
Right. You're right.
Anyway, any other comments or questions? All right. Well, if there are none, then you're blown away just like I am. But the next chapter, 22 and 23, the next two chapters are Rambam's going to bring the book of Eov, the book of Job, Sefer Eov, which is all about theodicy. It's all about a lot of these philosophical ideas, and he's going to demonstrate a lot of really cool stuff. And now I know that you won't have time to do this. If you haven't studied the book of Eov, I will give myself another self-promotion. I just finished teaching Eov on my podcast, Let the Prophet Speak. It took me almost an entire year to teach the whole book because it's such incredibly powerful and so full of such incredible insights. And and also one of the most difficult, not certainly the most difficult to translate from the Hebrew. The language is in many places impossible, but so that's another part of why it took so long. But and I translate everything, from the beginning by myself. Of course, I use the translations that are out there, but I still do my own when I do my podcast. So I strongly recommend, if you don't want to take a book of Eov yourself, listen to my podcasts. But there's a lot of them, so it's going to take you a long time. So you'll never have time this week to do it. But I still recommend doing it. Anyway, that's me promoting myself. So anyway, I guess
is there a particular podcast that we can access that would, given time constraints, that you would recommend just to
I'm not sure. I mean, they were all good. The first maybe 5 or 6, and then the last maybe 10, probably, without all of the arguments in the middle, would probably be the way to go if you really wanted a short version. But yeah, no, I mean, it's the Torah, it's the Bible. I mean, you can't skip over it. It's all precious. So anyway, yeah, so that's it. So have a wonderful night. I'm looking forward to next week. Thank you guys for joining. Thank you very much. All right, be well. All right.
Thank you.